They told us the Second World War ended in 1945, but hidden beneath the rubble of victory lies another truth, darker than any battlefield. The archives of the defeated nations were plundered, the victors wrote their histories, and entire files simply disappeared into locked vaults marked never to be released. Yet, scattered fragments of testimony, half-burned documents, and whispers from long-retired intelligence officers reveal that some of the war's most disturbing secrets did not die with the Reich or the Empire of Japan. Instead, they were erased, hidden under the seal of national security, buried in forgotten tunnels, or quietly absorbed into the arsenals of superpowers preparing for the Cold War. Each missing piece of history carries within it the weight of human suffering and the shadow of forbidden knowledge. Tonight we resurface these buried truths. 5 cases, each silenced without explanation. 5 secrets erased from the official record. 5 disturbing stories that were never meant to reach the public. This is not folklore nor rumor, but the silent testimony of erased files. And once you hear them, the question will not be whether you believe. They are too precise for that. The question will be, why were they hidden at all, and who still benefits from their disappearance? Chapter 1. The Erased Convoy of Arctic Shadows. On the night of March 25, 1945, as the northern seas froze under the grip of late winter, a German convoy, codenamed Eisnabel, departed Narvik under strict orders from the Oberkommando der Marine. The convoy, composed of 3 merchant vessels under Kriegsmarine escort, carried cargo unlike any other shipment of the war. Intelligence fragments recovered from broken Enigma transmissions suggest that inside the steel containers lay uranium oxide extracted from Czechoslovakian mines, as well as dismantled components from the V2 rocket program. The intended destination remains disputed. Some evidence points east, toward Japanese-held ports in Asia, part of the desperate Axis effort to share advanced weapons technology before defeat. Others suggest the convoy was bound for an undisclosed Arctic base, one of several rumored safe havens constructed in the final months of the Reich. British Admiralty records confirm that elements of the Royal Navy's 10th Escort Group, operating out of Scapa Flow, intercepted enemy transmissions on the same evening. The destroyer HMS Zealous and her companions were diverted to intercept. Yet after their pursuit, the record falls silent. Post-action reports note radar contact with multiple vessels, followed by what was described as sudden interference of unclassified origin. The destroyers claimed engagement, but the report lacks any tally of tonnage sunk, survivors captured, or cargo recovered. Instead, the file ends with a vague line written by the escort group's commander. Situation unresolved. No physical remains detected. Such a statement stands in stark contrast to naval protocol, where even the smallest skirmish demanded meticulous documentation. Declassified Soviet archives shed another layer of intrigue. A brief entry in the Northern Fleet War Diary for March 26th mentions strange interference in the Barents sector. Radio blackout lasted 31 minutes. Soviet units had been shadowing the area, but claimed they too found no debris or survivors. A subsequent notation, filed under Classified, Do Not Circulate, refers to electromagnetic anomalies, suggesting either a technological event not understood at the time or deliberate suppression of information. This entry, however, was heavily redacted in later Cold War transfers, leaving only fragmented phrases like unknown effect and source undisclosed. Where did Eisnabel vanish? Maritime tradition dictates that ships leave behind traces. Wreckage floating on the surface, oil slicks, bodies carried by the current. Yet none were recovered. Allied intelligence analysts debated whether the Germans had deployed scuttling charges to erase all evidence, or if the ships reached an undisclosed destination. Rumors circulated within intelligence circles that one of the cargo vessels bore the false designation of a neutral ship, allowing it to slip through Allied blockades. Another theory suggested the convoy had rendezvoused with U-boats specially equipped to transport high-value materials. But without physical proof, the case was quietly filed away, labeled Indeterminate Engagement. After the war, investigators attempted to trace the missing uranium. American occupation forces, through Operation Alsos, catalogued every known German stockpile of nuclear material. Yet, in reviewing captured German inventories, Allied scientists found unexplained discrepancies. Several tons of uranium oxide, expected to be in storage, could not be located. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, noted the discrepancy in a memorandum to Washington, stating, Certain shipments may have been removed from German custody prior to surrender. Further inquiry obstructed. That memorandum was classified for decades, fueling speculation about where those missing resources eventually surfaced. The Cold War added layers of silence. By the 1950s, Soviet scientists were advancing rapidly in their nuclear program, faster than many Western analysts expected. Some in the CIA suspected that German uranium shipments had fallen into Soviet hands, perhaps through convoys like Eisnebel. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence produced a confidential report in 1952 suggesting unknown foreign acquisition of enriched material of German origin. Whether this was speculation or based on hard evidence remains unknown, as the majority of the report was marked destroyed in 1967. Meanwhile, survivors of the Royal Navy crews involved were quietly instructed never to discuss the incident. Oral testimonies collected decades later describe senior officers issuing unusually strict confidentiality orders after the failed interception. Sailors recalled that the usual post-battle debrief never occurred, replaced instead by terse instructions that the matter was classified beyond naval purview. One officer recalled, "We saw ships on radar, then static, and then nothing. By dawn, there wasn't a scrap on the sea." These recollections, though anecdotal, suggest that even those present were left bewildered by the lack of aftermath. The story did not resurface publicly until the 1980s, when declassified fragments of naval intelligence began to reach researchers. A historian reviewing Admiralty files stumbled upon the entry for Eisnebel, only to discover that accompanying logs and cipher transcripts had been removed. Their withdrawal slips carried the chilling phrase, "retained under Crown interest, permanent." This meant that the documents were never to be released to the public, regardless of the passage of time. When journalists later submitted Freedom of Information requests, they were met with refusals citing national security implications, even 4 decades after the war. Further suspicion grew when fragments of German testimony, recorded during Allied interrogations of surviving Kriegsmarine officers, revealed references to a northern special convoy. Admiral Karl Dönitz, in one cryptic aside during a post-war interrogation, mentioned important cargo dispatched north in late March, purpose classified. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, citing his oath to the Reich. Whether this related directly to Eisnebel remains speculative, but the timing and description align too closely to dismiss. The erased convoy of the Arctic Shadows remains one of the most haunting mysteries of naval history. Did the ships sink, taking with them the final gamble of a collapsing Reich? Or did they slip unseen into the polar seas, delivering their deadly cargo to an unknown recipient? What stands certain is that both Western and Soviet records deliberately obscured the incident. The trail of missing uranium, vanished V2 components, and unexplained electromagnetic interference hints at a story far darker than the official histories allow. Some claim the truth remains locked in classified vaults, hidden beneath decades of Cold War secrecy. Others fear that fragments of the missing cargo entered the arsenals of superpowers, shaping the nuclear balance of the post-war world without the public ever knowing. What remains today is silence, a void in the record, an engagement without wreckage, and a convoy erased not only from the sea, but from history itself. In the frozen expanse of the Barents Sea, beneath waters that conceal more secrets than they reveal, the fate of Eisnebel drifts unanswered, guarded by the silence of those who ensured the truth would never surface. Chapter 2. Forbidden Experiments at Ravensbrück Compound. At first glance, Ravensbrück was known to the world as a women's concentration camp, a place of relentless suffering, where thousands perished under brutal conditions. Yet buried within its barbed wire, beyond the barracks and execution yards, existed a compound so secretive that even most SS guards were denied entry. It was here that medical units under Reich physician Dr. Karl Gebhardt conducted experiments the world would never fully acknowledge. Unlike the well-documented sulfonamide trials performed on Polish political prisoners, this program was known only by a code name scribbled in scattered Soviet interrogation transcripts. Project Schwarzer Regen, Black Rain. The fragments suggest that beginning in late 1944, Ravensbrück became host to experiments involving radioactive isotopes, a field not officially connected to Nazi Germany. Yet shipments from Norway's Norsk Hydro facility, guarded under SS seal, were traced toward northern Germany. From there, some of the crates vanished, reportedly rerouted to the camp under the personal authority of Himmler himself. Testimonies from surviving inmates make no direct mention of these experiments. Their silence is telling. The operations were confined to a small wing, separate from the main camp, and shrouded in secrecy. Soviet Smersh reports, captured in Berlin in May 1945, described medical operations of advanced physics application conducted under Gebhardt's direction. The interrogations, later classified by the NKVD, indicated that prisoners were injected with unknown solutions, while others were exposed to sealed containers emitting measurable radiation. In several cases, rapid onset hemorrhaging and systemic organ failure were reported. The Soviets marked the program as strategically relevant and transferred surviving documentation to Moscow. From there, the trail vanishes into the closed archives of the KGB. Western intelligence was not blind. Operation Paperclip, which sought to extract Nazi scientific knowledge for American use, included inquiries into German medical research. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, compiled a file titled Ravensbrück, Unclassified Research Projects. That file was later marked Destroyed 1951 file. Researchers attempting to retrieve it decades later found only a notation, removed from record by order of Department of Defense. The timing coincides with American nuclear research expansions at Fort Detrick and Oak Ridge, fueling speculation that fragments of Project Schwarzer-Regen were absorbed into early US radiological experiments. Survivor accounts, sparse but chilling, lend indirect support. In 1946, during testimony at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, a Polish survivor described a separate group of women being marched nightly to a restricted section of the camp. None of them ever returned. When prosecutors pressed for details, the tribunal dismissed the testimony as irrelevant to the charges at hand. The witness, visibly shaken, remarked, "They were taken to the Black Wing. We called it the burning house." The court moved on, leaving her words buried in the trial transcript. Researchers later linked this testimony to the same timeline referenced in Soviet reports on Projekt Schwarzer Regen, the question of radioactive. Experiments at Ravensbrück intersects with Nazi Germany's known interest in nuclear technology. Although the Reich never achieved a functioning atomic bomb, its physicists had studied uranium enrichment and reactor designs. Heavy water shipments from Norway were sabotaged by Allied commandos, but some material survived. The suggestion that portions of these shipments bypassed the scientific hubs at Hechingen or Leipzig and instead arrived at Ravensbrück raises unsettling implications. Why a concentration camp? Why women prisoners? The answer may lie in the nature of experimentation. Unlike controlled laboratory studies, the Ravensbrück operations appear designed for crude, direct observation of biological effects. Human bodies used as unwilling test subjects for exposure data. Soviet medical teams examining the camp after liberation noted unexplained contamination in soil samples taken near the compound's western perimeter. Their internal report, uncovered in Moscow archives in the 1990s, listed elevated radiation readings inconsistent with known medical supplies of the time. The notation at the bottom reads simply, "Containment ordered, information classified for military application." For decades, Soviet veterans spoke in whispers of a program they were instructed never to discuss. One retired Smersh officer reportedly told his grandson, "There were burns we did not understand, burns that came from light we could not see." The Americans, too, carried shadows of Ravensbrück into their Cold War research. By the 1950s, classified US projects such as Operation Green Run tested radioactive dispersal on civilian populations without consent. The parallel is difficult to ignore. Did the silence around Ravensbrück serve to protect those programs from international scrutiny? Researchers digging into CIA declassified files have discovered references to foreign-acquired biological effects studies. Germany, 1945. These lines, buried in technical memos, may point back to the erased experiments at the camp. The absence of physical records is striking. German archives list no official project under the codename Schwarzer-Regen. Yet gaps in SS medical records for late 1944 suggest that entire volumes were deliberately destroyed. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors presented thousands of pages of Nazi experimentation data, but nothing relating to radiation exposure. The silence, historians argue, is too complete to be accidental. Someone ensured that the program would remain hidden. One particularly disturbing theory is that Project Schwarzer-Regen represented a field trial for radiological weapons, a concept both the US and Soviet Union would later pursue. The idea was not to build a functioning atomic bomb, but to create devices that could contaminate wide areas with radioactive materials, rendering them uninhabitable. If true, the Ravensbrück victims may have been exposed to early prototypes of such technology. The project's erasure would then reflect not only Nazi guilt, but also Allied complicity in adopting the results. Today, the Ravensbrück Memorial in Germany acknowledges the medical experiments conducted there, but the narrative remains confined to sulfonamide and bone graft trials. No official recognition is given to radioactive research. Survivors who spoke of the Black Wing were either ignored or dismissed as unreliable witnesses. And yet, the fragments that remain, Soviet transcripts, American memoranda, survivor testimony, all converge on the same chilling implication. Something happened within those walls that the world was never meant to know. As historians continue to press for access to sealed Cold War archives, the truth about Project Schwarzer Regan may remain permanently obscured, but its shadow lingers in the soil of Ravensbrück, in the sealed vaults of Moscow and Washington, and in the silence of governments unwilling to confront the past. The victims, nameless and uncounted, serve as the only testimony left behind. Their suffering was erased not only by the SS, but by the victors who decided that some truths were too dangerous, too inconvenient, to be remembered. And so, the forbidden experiments of Ravensbrück remain a wound cut from history, sealed beneath layers of secrecy that endure to this day. Chapter 3. Churchill's Vanished Secret Treaty Files. The spring of 1945 was a moment of collapse for the Third Reich and unease for the Allies. As the Red Army stormed through eastern Germany and American forces crossed the Rhine, a new reality emerged. Victory over Hitler was certain, but what followed could be a confrontation even more dangerous. Winston Churchill, exhausted yet still calculating, feared above all the expansion of Soviet power across Europe. In this climate of desperation, a disturbing set of documents was created, records of secret negotiations between British intermediaries and remnants of the SS. They were said to contain proposals for what history now calls the Vanished Treaty Files. Their details were erased from the official record, but fragments that survived hint at a chilling bargain. Advanced German weapons in exchange for consideration, perhaps even immunity, for selected Nazi officials who could prove useful in the coming struggle against Stalin. The codename most often associated with these negotiations was Operation Unthinkable. Today, it is remembered primarily as Churchill's audacious plan for a possible Allied assault on the Soviet Union. But beneath that military outline lay layers of political maneuvering, unofficial channels, and covert contacts. In Stockholm and Bern, intelligence officers reported unusual meetings between German envoys and figures with connections to British intelligence. Among them was SS General Karl Wolff, who had already entered into talks with the Americans in Italy under Operation Sunrise. Wolff's shadow appears in several intercepted communications, where he spoke of transferring technological archives in exchange for personal security. Yet the most disturbing fragments involved jet propulsion data, chemical weapons formulas, and rumors of biological research, all materials of immense value to a world on the cusp of the Cold War. What makes these files unique is not only their contents, but their disappearance. In the early 1950s, a researcher at the British National Archives noted that entire boxes labelled Churchill, Special Negotiations 1945 had been withdrawn from catalogues. The withdrawal slip cited, "retained under Crown interest." Unlike ordinary files that are delayed for decades before release, these were marked permanent retention, never to be opened. Inquiries under Britain's Freedom of Information Act were consistently rejected, citing national security even half a century later. The implication was clear. These documents contained matters too explosive for public disclosure. One fragment, however, escaped. A memorandum attributed to MI6 Chief Stuart Menzies surfaced in 1973, uncovered among private papers. The memo, dated June 1945, referenced proposals concerning Messerschmitt propulsion systems, not for circulation beyond the highest level. Historians believe this refers to the revolutionary jet engines powering the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter. The Soviets captured many of these aircraft, But the suggestion that Britain also sought access through clandestine negotiation reveals the scale of interest. Even more troubling, the same memorandum warned files to be withheld for security interests of the Crown. This exact phrase matches the archival withdrawal notes, linking the missing treaty files directly to Menzies' directive. Soviet intelligence did not remain ignorant. Declassified KGB reports from 1946 refer to Anglo-German channels seeking to preserve technical cadre. In Moscow's view, Churchill's government was attempting to divert German scientists away from Soviet reach. These reports, filed under the codename Operation Pike, listed not only propulsion technology but also nerve agents and dispersal systems, technologies pioneered by German laboratories at Die Herrenfurth and IG Farben. The Soviets suspected that Britain, and perhaps the United States, were willing to bargain with war criminals to secure an advantage against their former ally. Such accusations were never proven publicly, but the sudden vanishing of relevant files in London lends weight to the suspicion. Witnesses to the erasure exist, though their voices are faint. In the 1960s, a retired British intelligence officer privately told a historian that he had once handled papers describing a tentative arrangement with SS contacts. He described them as politically impossible and claimed they were locked away for good reason. His account, though unverifiable, matches what fragments suggest: the existence of negotiations that contradicted the official stance of unconditional surrender. The officer insisted that Churchill himself had been aware, perhaps even complicit, though he left the operational details to trusted subordinates. For obvious reasons, the statement was never made public during his lifetime. There are darker implications. If indeed such files included proposals of leniency, one must ask, were certain Nazi figures spared from prosecution not because of lack of evidence, but because of usefulness? The case of Werner von Braun and other rocket scientists relocated through Operation Paperclip demonstrates how the West willingly overlooked guilt in the name of technological progress. The vanished treaty files suggest that this pragmatic compromise may have been planned even before the guns fell silent. Some speculate that Britain aimed to secure its own share of German expertise before the Americans monopolized it. Others believe Churchill saw the files as bargaining chips, leverage in his anticipated confrontation with Stalin. The disappearance of the treaty records also raises questions about deliberate suppression. During the Cold War, when Churchill left office in 1945, the Labour government may have sought to bury the files to distance Britain from the appearance of collaboration with former enemies. Later, during Churchill's return to power in the early 1950s, secrecy would have been equally important. Admitting to such negotiations could have destabilized NATO, already fragile in its early years. By the 1960s, with both nuclear arsenals growing, there was little incentive for either Britain or the United States to reopen wounds, and so the files remained sealed, locked in the deepest vaults of Whitehall. Even today, scholars are left with questions that may never be answered. Did Churchill authorize the contacts personally, or were they the initiative of ambitious intelligence officers? Were advanced German weapons technologies traded for promises, or was the entire scheme a desperate bluff? And most chilling of all, did those files record a moment when Britain considered making common cause with the remnants of the very regime it had spent 6 years fighting, all in the name of preparing for a new enemy? The vanished treaty files stand as a symbol of erased history. Their absence is more telling than their presence would ever have been. By disappearing, they confirm that something existed, something deemed too dangerous for the light of day. They suggest that the end of the Second World War was not the triumphal closing act we imagine, but a murky transition where alliances shifted, loyalties blurred, and forbidden bargains were struck in the shadows. Until the day those files are released, if that day ever comes, the truth will remain sealed, a secret pact buried under the weight of national security, its consequences echoing silently through the corridors of modern history. Chapter 4: The Lost Train of Lower Silesia. In the final desperate months of the Third Reich, as the Red Army swept relentlessly westward and the Reich's borders crumbled, rumours began to spread among German civilians and soldiers alike of a heavily fortified armoured train departing from Breslau, now Wrocław, in early 1945. Its departure was not an ordinary evacuation. Witnesses described wagons sealed with SS insignia, escorted by heavily armed guards, carrying crates of Reichsbank gold, looted European art, and something referred to only as special weapons cargo. The train, whispered about in coded German reports, became the stuff of legend. But unlike most legends, this one was never debunked. It was erased. According to Polish railway workers questioned after the war, the train was last seen moving southwest toward the Owl Mountains and the fortified tunnels of Project Reese, Hitler's vast underground construction complex. From there, the story vanishes. The tunnels, partially completed and riddled with collapsed sections, were ideal for concealing such a convoy. Explosions reported by locals around May 1945 suggested deliberate demolition, sealing whatever lay inside. Soviet units arriving in the area attempted excavation but abandoned their efforts, recording in their diaries the cryptic phrase, "Cargo compromised, details classified." That single line, buried in Soviet archives, remains one of the only official references to the so-called Silesian ghost train. Polish miners decades later told stories of stumbling upon scorched rail fragments deep underground, only to be driven away by sudden military interest. In the 1950s, Warsaw Pact engineers surveyed the tunnels under strict secrecy, declaring them unstable and hazardous. Yet locals noticed trucks arriving at night, hauling unknown materials away. The Polish state dismissed speculation, but rumors persisted that the Soviets had extracted certain items from the train before sealing the site permanently. NATO intelligence reports declassified in the 1990s added fuel to the fire, noting references to unrecovered armoured transport in Silesia, and speculating that its cargo included uranium ore or dismantled jet prototypes. The files, though heavily redacted, revealed NATO had taken the legend seriously enough to warrant surveillance of the area. The train's mystery is inseparable from the chaos of Operation Reese. Conceived as part of the Reich's last stand, Reis consisted of vast underground chambers carved into the mountains, intended to house armament factories, or even Hitler's final command headquarters. Thousands of slave laborers from concentration camps perished in the construction. When the Soviets arrived, they found partially completed tunnels, machinery left idle, and signs of hasty demolition. Yet within the labyrinth, no trace of the armored train was discovered. Some argued it never existed, a fabrication born of desperation. But the persistence of testimony, both German and Polish, suggests otherwise. Trains were indeed redirected toward the Owl Mountains in 1945, and Reich authorities did issue unusual transport orders. The records of those orders, however, vanish mid-March 1945, erased from Reichsbahn archives. For historians, the central question remains, what was the special weapons cargo? Some point to uranium ore shipments evacuated from Czechoslovakia as the Allies advanced, aligning with documented German efforts to preserve nuclear research. Others argue the cargo consisted of jet engines, prototypes of the Messerschmitt 262, or even the Horten 229 flying wing. Both were technologies the Allies raced to secure in the war's final days. A darker possibility suggests the train carried documentation and prototypes related to chemical and biological weapons. Stocks of Tarban nerve agent produced in Die Herrenfurth lay nearby. These materials were of immense interest to both Soviet and Western intelligence, yet much of it mysteriously disappeared after the war. The cultural treasures allegedly loaded onto the train are equally elusive. Testimony from residents of Breslau describes trucks filled with paintings and crates from museums, transferred to the rail yard under armed escort. The Reich had systematically looted Europe's art collections, and as defeat loomed, Himmler ordered treasures relocated to secret caches. Entire collections disappeared, resurfacing only in fragments decades later. If the lost train carried even a portion of this material, it would represent one of the greatest hoards of missing cultural property in history. Yet art historians and treasure hunters who scoured the region after 1945 found nothing, only sealed tunnels and silence. The Soviet silence is perhaps the most telling element. The Red Army, famously thorough in plundering captured German assets, had every reason to publicize the discovery of Reich gold or masterpieces as proof of victory. Instead, they remained quiet, acknowledging only in whispers that a train had been sought but not found. Polish records from the early Cold War indicate Soviet officers established cordoned-off zones in the Owl Mountains, restricting access for years. When pressed by local authorities, Soviet officials declared the operations were related to geological studies. Few believed the explanation. In modern times, The legend of the Silesian ghost train continues to attract explorers and speculators. In 2015, Polish treasure hunters announced they had located the train using ground-penetrating radar, sparking international headlines. Excavations, however, revealed nothing but geological anomalies. The Polish government eventually dismissed the claim, yet the frenzy it unleashed demonstrated how deeply the story resonates. Beneath the frenzy lies an uncomfortable truth. The legend persists because fragments of fact support it. Too many witnesses, too many missing documents, and too many unexplained gaps in the record suggest that something did depart Breslau in 1945 and was never seen again. The lost train of Lower Silesia remains less a treasure hunt than a symbol of deliberate erasure. If the cargo was cultural, why did the Soviets conceal its fate? If it was technological, did fragments feed into Soviet and Western arsenals, shaping the Cold War balance? Or, most disturbingly, if it was radioactive, was it buried deliberately to prevent contamination or weaponization? These questions linger unanswered. What endures is silence. Silence from Moscow, silence from London, silence from Warsaw. The tunnels remain sealed, the documents withheld, and the truth entombed beneath stone and secrecy. In the absence of answers, the lost train continues to roll. Not across rails, but through history's shadows. An armored phantom carrying with it the last forbidden secrets of a dying Reich. Chapter 5. Japan's Erased Manchurian Bioarsenal. In the shadow of Japan's wartime empire, hidden deep within the occupied territory of Manchuria, stood facilities so secret that even many within the Imperial Army were unaware of their existence. These compounds belonged to Unit 731 and its sister units, the most infamous biological warfare program in history. Behind barbed wire and under the cover of agricultural research stations, Japanese scientists, under General Shiro Ishii, developed weapons intended not only to kill soldiers, but to devastate entire populations. They perfected plague-infested fleas, cholera-laced wells, and anthrax dispersal devices. Human subjects, Chinese civilians, Allied prisoners of war, and even Russian captives were used as unwilling test material. Many were vivisected without anesthesia. Others deliberately infected and observed until death. These crimes, horrific beyond measure, were not only committed, they were systematically erased after Japan's surrender. When the Soviets advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, entire laboratories were destroyed in a matter of days. Witnesses reported bonfires consuming mountains of documents, glass tanks smashed, and cages of infected animals burned alive. Surviving Japanese officers were under direct orders: leave no trace of Unit 731's work. Yet they could not erase everything. Soviet SMERSH teams captured fragments, testimony from fleeing personnel, scattered samples, even equipment buried hastily in the ground. Their reports, classified immediately, spoke of pathogens never before weaponized on such a scale. In Moscow, the findings were marked strategic priority, but no public trials followed. Instead, silence descended. On the American side, a different story unfolded. Occupation authorities in Tokyo, aware of the program's scope, quickly realized its potential value. General Douglas MacArthur authorized secret negotiations with Ishii and his associates. The bargain was simple: immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete transfer of research. Internal memoranda later declassified confirm this arrangement. A US Army report dated May 1947 bluntly stated, "Data on human trials of biological agents acquired from Japanese sources. Agreement reached to forego war crimes charges." The men who had orchestrated death on an industrial scale escaped the gallows, while their research found its way to Fort Detrick in Maryland, where America's biological warfare program was being quietly established. The erasure extended beyond individuals to entire archives. Trial proceedings at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East largely omitted evidence of Japanese biowarfare. Prosecutors in Tokyo had collected testimonies and documents, but they were abruptly withdrawn under American pressure. Soviet judges protested, but the US delegation insisted such matters were outside scope. The real reason was clear: exposing the atrocities would reveal the immunity deal and compromise American control over the data. Thus, the crimes of Unit 731 were never fully aired in court. Thousands of victims were written out of history, sacrificed to secrecy. The missing arsenal itself remains a point of chilling speculation. Soviet archives admit that vast stores of pathogens were unaccounted for: anthrax, plague cultures and cholera reserves vanished during the hurried evacuation? Did they perish in fire, or were they relocated to undisclosed facilities? Some Soviet scientists later hinted that experimental strains reappeared in closed laboratories in Novosibirsk, feeding the USSR's growing bioweapons program. In the West, CIA memoranda from the early 1950s noted foreign acquisition of Japanese-origin biological materials, though whether this referred to Soviet or American holdings is unclear. The language was vague, but the implication was unmistakable. Pieces of Unit 731's arsenal survived. For the people of Manchuria, the legacy of Unit 731 did not vanish. Villagers recalled outbreaks of plague and anthrax in the immediate post-war years, long after the war had ended. Epidemiological studies conducted in the 1980s revealed unusual patterns of disease in regions near the old laboratories. Survivors spoke of strange scars, chronic illnesses, and unmarked graves. Yet their voices were long dismissed as rumor, their suffering officially unacknowledged until decades later. Even today, monuments to the victims face political resistance, as governments remain reluctant to confront the full scale of what was buried. The suppression of Unit 731's crimes was not merely a Japanese effort, it was a collaboration of victors. For the United States, the program's data offered a shortcut in biological warfare research. For the Soviets, it provided both propaganda value and scientific insight. Both superpowers had reason to conceal, distort, or appropriate the evidence. And so, an arsenal designed to unleash unimaginable suffering was not destroyed, it was absorbed. Hidden within Cold War laboratories. Transformed into knowledge leveraged for power. In 1980, a declassified CIA memorandum admitted that portions of the Unit 731 archive remain in classified retention for national security purposes. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, and chilling. It confirmed what survivors had long known. The truth was never fully revealed, because it was too valuable to expose. The erased Manchurian bioarsenal continues to cast a long shadow, one of the darkest in modern history. Its victims, denied justice, were silenced not only by their captors, but by the world powers that inherited their suffering. And the pathogens that once roamed the laboratories of Harbin may still, in some form, survive, in locked freezers, in forgotten archives, or in the classified files of nations that chose secrecy over justice. The silence that follows their trail is not accidental. It is engineered, deliberate, and enduring. History often ends not with revelation, but with silence. The Second World War left millions dead, cities in ruins, and regimes toppled. Yet behind the official story of liberation and victory lie the shadows we have explored tonight. Secrets erased, files vanished, truths buried under the weight of Cold War necessity. A convoy that dissolved without wreckage in the Arctic. Experiments in Ravensbrück so disturbing that even Nuremberg ignored them. Treaty files deliberately hidden from Britain's archives. A phantom train entombed in Lower Silesia. And Japan's biological arsenal traded for immunity. Each is a fragment of a history rewritten, edited to protect the interests of those who inherited power. These are not stories of rumor alone, but of redacted documents, sealed vaults, and testimonies too dangerous to acknowledge. What we see is only the outline of what was concealed, and as long as archives remain sealed, as long as governments refuse transparency, we may never know the full truth. Yet the silence itself speaks volumes. For every vanished file, there are victims who are denied justice, histories denied remembrance, and questions that echo still. Who erased these secrets? Who profited from their disappearance? And how many more remain hidden, waiting in the shadows of the past to remind us that victory does not always mean truth?